The studio lights blazed, the audience roared, and Eleanor Carrington, the renowned host with a razor-sharp wit, flashed a confident smile. Tonight, she had a special guest, Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood legend, an old-school masculine icon. But for Fiona, this wasn't just an interview, it was a spectacular takedown. With a sarcastic tone, she opened with a biting joke. The audience erupted in laughter, ready to watch Clint get steamrolled. But when he spoke, the entire studio fell silent. No one expected that with just a simple reply, he would turn the tables. So, what did Clint say that left the room in stunned silence? Stay tuned until the end to discover the unexpected. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another inspiring story, tailored just for you. The story begins. The dazzling studio lights illuminated the sleek set of Spotlight, the late-night show where Eleanor Carrington reigned supreme. Known for her acerbic humor and unyielding progressive stance, Eleanor had carved out a unique niche in the late-night television landscape as a fearless voice, one who skewered political figures, celebrities, and cultural conservatives with equal fervor. Her audience adored her for it, tuning in nightly to watch her eviscerate her guests with her biting wit and unapologetic saire. It was during a routine production meeting that one of her producers floated the idea of inviting Clint Eastwood onto the show. The room buzzed with excitement and skepticism. Clint, a Hollywood legend with an unmistakable presence, had been both admired and derided over the years. His iconic roles in westerns and gritty dramas were overshadowed in some circles by his outspoken conservative views. Eleanor's eyes lit up at the suggestion. It wasn't just an opportunity to boost ratings. It was a chance to expose what she considered outdated ideals personified by the man himself. Never one to approach a task unprepared, Eleanor dove into research with a fervor. Clips from Clint's movies and interviews flickered across her laptop as she scribbled notes in the margins of her outline. She couldn't help but smirk at the thought of juxtaposing her sharp modernity with Clint's stoic, old-school demeanor. For her, this wasn't just an interview. It was a confrontation. Her audience would eat it up, she thought, picturing the waves of laughter that would erupt as she delivered her scathing remarks. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood was at his ranch in Carmel, California, when he received the invitation. He sat in his sun-drenched kitchen, the letter in one hand and a mug of black coffee in the other. His assistant, a young man named Ethan, sized up the situation carefully before speaking. "Are you sure you want to do this, Clint?" "Eleanor Carrington isn't exactly friendly territory," Ethan said cautiously. Clint gave a faint smile, his weathered face betraying neither annoyance nor apprehension. Friendly or not, a conversation is a conversation. People can say what they want. It doesn't change the truth. Ethan was unconvinced. He'd seen enough of Eleanor's interviews to know how ruthless she could be. "She'll come after you, you know. She'll bring up politics, your movies, probably even your age." Clint shrugged. "Let her." He set the letter down on the table and gazed out the window toward the rolling hills in the distance. Sometimes it's not about winning or losing. It's about showing up. The days leading up to the interview were a whirlwind for both sides. Eleanor's team meticulously crafted her questions, ensuring each barb contained just the right amount of irony and humor to elicit laughter from the live audience. Clint, on the other hand, continued his routine as if nothing unusual were happening. He refused to rehearse or plan rebuttals, trusting his instincts to guide him. As the day of the taping arrived, the studio buzzed with energy. The live audience filed in, a mix of regular fans and curious onlookers eager to see how the night would unfold. Eleanor rehearsed her opening lines backstage, her confidence unwavering in the green room. Clint waited patiently, sipping water and exchanging polite nods with the crew members. For Fiona, it was another night of witty repartee and cultural commentary. For Clint, it was an opportunity to share his perspective with an audience that might never have heard it. Neither could have predicted how the night would change them, or the conversation it would spark across the nation. The palpable energy of the studio was unmistakable as the live audience filed in, their chatter a hum of anticipation. The spotlight late-night set gleamed under the bright studio lights, with its iconic desk, gray sleek armchairs, and city skyline backdrop abrumlaya the scene. Eleanor Carrington's name was emblazoned on screens around the studio, a reminder of the star power she wielded as the show's charismatic host. Eleanor was in her element backstage, surrounded by her team of producers and assistants. She ran through her notes one last time, satisfied smirk playing on her lips. The monologue she had prepared was sharp and biting, filled with clever jabs aimed squarely at Clint Eastwood. She rehearsed a few lines under her breath, savoring the impact they would have. "Tonight is going to be legendary," Eleanor said to her head writer, Veronica, who nodded enthusiastically. "It's going to be a ratings hit for sure," Scarlett replied. "Clint is a walking icon of everything your audience loves to critique. Just remember to keep it playful. Don't give him too much room to react." Eleanor quipped, adjusting her microphone. "He's almost 94. He won't be able to keep up with me." Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood arrived at the studio with little fanfare, sporting a tailored jacket and jeans. He moved with a quiet confidence that turned heads without effort. His assistant, Ethan, trailed behind him, still visibly anxious about the night ahead. "Last chance to change your mind," Ethan said as they walked down the hallway to the green room. Clint chuckled. "You worry too much. It's just a conversation." In the green room, Clint settled into a gray chair, sipping water and watching the monitor as the show's opening segment played. He listened to the audience roar as Eleanor's name was announced, the sound reverberating through the building. Ethan paced nearby, unable to sit still. "Look at that crowd," Ethan muttered. "They're eating out of her hand already." Clint glanced at the monitor, observing Eleanor as she took the stage with her characteristic swagger. "That's her job," he said simply, leaning back in his gray chair. "Everyone wants to speak the truth. Let us see what truth comes out on the stage." Eleanor began her monologue, her delivery polished and energetic. She opened with a few light-hearted chute before transitioning to her guest of the night. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a legend in the house tonight," she began, her tone dripping sour. "Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood icon, a symbol of old-school masculinity, and a man who still thinks talking to an empty chair is a good form of entertainment." The audience roared with laughter, some clapping as Eleanor grinned, pleased with their reaction. She continued with a series of quips about Clint's movies, his political views, and even his advanced age. Backstage, Clint watched with mild amusement, his expression unreadable. Ethan, however, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "She's laying it on thick," he muttered. Clint nodded slightly. "She's doing her job. Let her have her fun." When Eleanor finally introduced Clint, the applause was mixed with a few cheers and some scattered whistles. She extended her hand as he walked onto the stage, and Clint shook it firmly, his face calm and composed. He tipped his hat to the audience before taking a seat, earning a few chuckles and sparse glare. "Mr. Eastwood, welcome to the show," Eleanor began, her tone light but laced with a hint of sarcasm. "Thank you for having me," Clint replied, his voice steady. "Good crowd you've got here." The tension in the room was almost palpable as Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Oh, they're great. They love a good debate. Ready to engage?" Clint gave a slight smile. "Always." And with that, the curtain on their verbal sparring match was officially raised. The studio crackled with the promise of fireworks. Both host and guest were poised, albeit for entirely different reasons. Eleanor was ready to dominate, while Clint remained calm, knowing he had nothing to prove. The atmosphere in the studio was electric as Eleanor leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk, ready to fire the first shot. Clint sat opposite her, relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the arms of his gray chair. The stark contrast between their energies was striking. Eleanor exuded sharp wit and energy, while Clint radiated a calm, unshakable confidence that seemed to slightly unsettle her. "So, Clint," Eleanor began with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You've had quite a long career, over 6 decades. Isn't it? That's impressive. Do you ever look back and think maybe it's time for a new generation to take the reins?" The audience chuckled, clearly siding with Fiona. Clint tilted his head slightly, considering her question. Well, Fiona, he said in his gravelly voice, I've always believed that work isn't about age, it's about what you bring to the table. Whether you're 25 or 94, if you have something worthwhile to say or do, why stop? His calm response drew a few polite glare from the audience, but Eleanor wasn't finished. Sure, but times change, don't they? She pressed. I mean, your earlier films, they're classics, no doubt, but let's be honest, they weren't exactly known for their progressive portrayals of women or minorities. Do you ever feel that maybe the old-school values you depict are no longer relevant? The crowd oohed and clapped, clearly enjoying her pointed question. Clint remained unfazed, leaning back slightly in his gray chair. I think it's important to remember, he began, his voice steady, that movies are a reflection of their times. They capture what people are thinking, feeling, and struggling with. Sure, some of it doesn't age well, but that's true of anything in life. Progress is about learning from the past, not erasing it. The laughter died down as the audience digested his words. Eleanor sensed the shift, quickly changing tack. Fair enough, she conceded with a shrug. But let's talk about politics. You've been quite vocal about your views over the years, and let's just say they don't exactly align with, well, a lot of folks here. Are you ever worried that being so outspoken might alienate people who used to admire you? Clint gave a gentle smile, his eyes meeting hers. I've always believed in being honest about who I am and what I stand for. If that means some people don't like me, so be it. Integrity isn't about being liked. It's about standing by your principles even when it's not convenient. A murmur rippled through the audience, a mix of agreement and skepticism, determined to maintain the upper hand. Eleanor leaned in. But don't you think that kind of stubbornness could be seen as outdated? She asked, her voice laced with mock concern. I mean, the world is moving on, and some might say you're clinging to the past. Clint chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling. You call it clinging. I call it holding onto the foundation. The world moves fast, Fiona, but sometimes in the rush to change, it forgets the value of what came before. The studio fell silent for a moment, the audience taken aback by the simplicity and clarity of his statement. Eleanor hesitated, sensing the shift in the crowd's attention. Fair point, she said after a pause, her tone subdued. But surely you can admit there's room for improvement in how we've done things? Of course, Clint replied immediately. There's always room for improvement, but improvement doesn't mean throwing out the foundation. It means building upon it. You can't write a new chapter if you're too busy tearing out the old pages. The audience, who had been so eager to applaud Fiona's earlier barbs, now sat in thoughtful silence. Even Fiona, who prided herself on her quick wit, found herself temporarily at a loss for words. The exchange continued, Eleanor lobbing sharp questions and Clint responding with calm, considered answers. The contrast between them was stark, one driven by energy and provocatia, the other by quiet conviction. Gradually, the balance of power on the stage began to shift, and the audience, once firmly on Fiona's side, started to see Clint in a new light. By the end of the segment, Eleanor's attempts at humor felt strained, while Clint's authenticity resonated. It was clear this wasn't a typical interview, and the audience, though still unsure of where they stood, couldn't help but feel a growing respect for the man they had come to mock. Eleanor leaned across her desk, her smile fixed and practiced as she fired off another pointed question. Her words dripped with the satire her audience loved, this time accusing Clint of promoting toxic masculinity through his earlier films. Let's talk about those westerns, she said, her tone both playful and sharp. Do you ever feel that the characters you played, these tough guys with guns, solving problems with violence, contributed to some, let's just say, unhealthy ideas about masculinity that we see today? The audience laughed, clapping and cheering at Fiona's deftly crafted jab. She sat back, basking in the energy of the room. Clint, however, remained unfazed. He nodded slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips as he let the laughter subside. Well, Fiona, he said, his voice calm and deliberate, I think it's easy to look at things through the lens of today and forget what they represented at the time. Those characters weren't just tough guys with guns. They were symbols of resilience, independence, and the fight for justice in a world that didn't always play fair. If that's toxic, then I guess we have different definitions. The room fell silent, the laughter and cheers abruptly replaced by an air of curiosity. Eleanor blinked for a moment, taken aback by his composed response. She hadn't expected him to meet her sharp criticisms with such unwavering conviction. Well, she said, quickly regaining her composure, that's an interesting way to look at it. But surely you can admit that some of those films glorified violence, didn't they? Don't you think that sends the wrong message, especially to young audiences? Clint leaned forward slightly, his weathered hands clasped together. Violence is a part of life, Fiona. Always has been. But those stories weren't about glorifying it. They were about confronting it. They were about characters having to make tough choices in a harsh world. Life isn't clean or simple, and sometimes you have to face the ugliness head-on to protect what matters. The gravity in his voice silenced the audience, many of whom found themselves nodding in agreement. Eleanor sensed the shift, deciding to pivot. Fair enough, she said with a strained smile, but let's move away from the past. Let's talk about the present. You've been quite vocal about your political views, some would say controversially so. Do you think that's hurt your legacy, alienated fans who used to admire you? Clint leaned back in his gray chair, his face contemplative but not at all bothered. It's possible, he conceded, but I've never been concerned with being liked, Fiona. I've been concerned with being honest. You can't please everyone, and if you try, you lose yourself in the process. My views aren't meant to make people happy. They're meant to reflect what I believe is right, and that's all any of us can do. For a moment, Eleanor was at a loss. Her usual strategy of turning her guests' words against them had failed. Clint wasn't defensive, nor was he flustered. Instead, he answered her questions with a quiet sincerity that was beginning to win over the room. Deciding to take a risk, Eleanor leaned in. You seem quite comfortable with who you are, she said, her tone softening slightly. But don't you think there's value in evolving, in opusca old ideas and embracing new ones? Clint's eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. Of course, there is, he said, but evolution doesn't mean abandoning your roots. It means understanding them, learning from them, and carrying forward what's worth keeping. The problem with the world today is that too many people want to tear everything down without thinking about what they're building in its place. The silence that followed was profound. Even Fiona, who had built her career on dominating conversations, found herself at a loss for words. Clint's statement hung in the air, resonating deeply with the audience. Sensing the shift in the room, Clint glanced at the crowd, his expression softening. Look, I get it, he said. I'm old, and my views might seem outdated to some of you. But here's the thing. Life isn't about always being right. It's about being true to yourself even when it's hard, and it's about listening even when you disagree. A young woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes. The audience, who had been so quick to laugh and cheer earlier, now sat in thoughtful silence. Even Eleanor seemed momentarily subdued, her usual confidence replaced by a hint of reflection. Mind if I tell a little story? Clint asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a hot knife through butter. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Go ahead, she said, her voice softer. And as Clint began to speak, the dynamic in the studio shifted completely. What had started as a sparring match had turned into something deeper, a conversation that would leave everyone in the room, including Fiona, forever changed. Clint sat slightly forward in his gray chair, his craggy face calm but thoughtful as he began to speak. The audience leaned in, sensing that something important was about to unfold. Fiona, her usual sharpness subdued, watched him intently, unsure of what was to come. Clint began, his voice steady and unhurried. People look at the end of a journey and think it must have been smooth sailing to get there. But Hollywood wasn't kind to anyone, especially not to a kid like me in the 50s. I wasn't anyone special, just a lanky guy with bad hair, a voice people said was too soft for the screen, and no real idea what I was doing. The audience chuckled softly, caught off guard by Clint's self-deprecating humor. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his unexpected humility. When I first came to Hollywood, Clint continued, I was a nobody. I took odd jobs, construction, truck driving, anything to make ends meet. I landed my first acting gig as an extra, and let me tell you, I was terrible. I got called out for my stiff acting or the awkward grin I couldn't seem to fix. Casting directors wouldn't give me a second look. One even told me, "Kid, you'll never make it. You don't have the face or the talent." The audience was silent, now riveted by his every word. Clint's voice carried a weight that made his experiences feel real and raw, not just stories from a distant past. "I could have given up," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Most people would have. But I didn't, not because I thought I was destined for greatness, but because something inside me said keep going. I worked harder. I learned from every mistake, every rejection. I studied people, how they walked, how they talked, how they carried themselves. And when the acting jobs didn't come, I didn't sit around waiting. I built furniture, taught myself how to work with my hands. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me going." Fiona, who had been poised to jump in with another question, found herself unable to prove. There was a sincerity in Clint's voice that was disarming her usual defenses. "And then one day, I got lucky," Clint said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "A small studio needed someone to play a cowboy. They didn't think much of me, but I had the look and the right price. They didn't have to pay me much. That's how I landed on Rawhide. It wasn't a big deal at the time, just another TV show. But to me, it was everything. It was a chance to prove I could do this. So I gave it all I had." He paused, his eyes distant as if reliving those early days. "The funny thing about opportunities is they don't come with guarantees. You get your shot, and what you do with it is up to you. I worked harder than I ever had, not because I wanted fame or money, but because I wanted to honor the chance I'd been given. And slowly, things started to change. I learned, I grew, I got better." The audience was completely captivated. Their earlier jeers and laughter had been replaced by a reverent silence. Even Eleanor found herself leaning bleisure, her usual sharpness momentarily forgotten. "But Hollywood," Clint said, his tone deepening, "it tests you. Success doesn't mean the challenges stop. If anything, they get harder. People try to mold you, tell you what you can and can't do. I had to fight to stay true to myself. There were times I turned down roles because they didn't feel right, even when I needed the money. I wasn't interested in being someone else's idea of a star. I just wanted to do good work and be honest about who I was." Clint looked out at the audience, his expression calm but resolute. "And you know what I learned through it all? Integrity isn't about the big moments. It's about the small ones, the times when no one's watching and you still do the right thing, the times you choose the hard path because it's the right path. That's what's kept me going all these years." A young man in the crowd nodded, his face pensive, while a middle-aged woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes. Clint's words weren't just a story about his life. They were a mirror reflecting the struggles and decisions that resonated with everyone in the room. Eleanor cleared her throat, her voice softer than usual. "That's quite a journey," she said, the edge in her tones maintenant absent. "But surely there were times you doubted yourself. Times you wanted to give up." Clint nodded, his face softening. "Of course, everyone has doubts, Fiona, but the thing is, doubt is just a part of the process. It's not a sign to stop, it's a sign to keep going. And if you're honest with yourself, the path becomes clear even when it's not easy." The studio was silent, the weight of Clint's words settling over the room like a warm blanket. Eleanor leaned back in her chair for the first time, unsure of what to say next. Clint had done something zamechatelny. He had turned a stage set for confrontation into a space for reflection and connection. As the segment drew to a close and the Stvordiznakdon signaled for a commercial break, the audience erupted in applause, not the polite kind that followed Fiona's monologue, but the heartfelt, from the gut kind reserved for moments that truly mattered. Clint, ever humble, nodded slightly and gave a faint smile. For Fiona, a realization began to dawn. This wasn't going to be the takedown she had envisioned. Clint Eastwood wasn't just an old actor with outdated ideas. He was a man who had lived through battles both on and off screen and emerged with a wisdom that couldn't be ignored. As the applause from the commercial break faded, the studio lights dimmed slightly, creating a more intimate atmosphere. Clint leaned back in his gray chair, his posture calm but deliberate, as if he were sitting across from an old friend rather than facing a roomful of strangers and a sharp-tongued host. Eleanor was more subdued after Clint's heartfelt story about his Hollywood journey, hesitating for a moment before steering the conversation forward. "Clint," she began, her tone softer, "you've spoken a lot about your experiences in Hollywood and staying true to yourself, but let's be honest, life isn't always that simple. What happens when things get so tough that resilience doesn't feel like enough? Surely even you have faced moments where giving up seemed easier." Clint nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful as he considered her question. "You're right," he said. "There were plenty of times I felt it would have been easier to quit. I'm not immune to doubt or strach, none of us are. But resilience isn't about never feeling those things. It's about how you respond to them." The audience listened intently, their earlier skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. Clint's words carried a weight that commanded attention, cutting through the usual banter of the show. Clint continued, his voice steady, "I think people misunderstand resilience. They think it's about being tough all the time, about never slamatza or bend, but that's not it. Resilience is about learning to bend without slamatza. It's about knowing that even when life knocks you down, you have the strength to get back up, no matter how many times it takes." Eleanor tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. "And where do you think that strength comes from?" she asked, her voice no longer challenging but curious. Clint gave a faint smile. "From the small things," he said, "from the people who believe in you when you don't believe in yourself, from the lessons you learn the hard way, the mistakes that teach you who you are, and most importantly, from knowing your purpose, the reason you're doing what you're doing. If you don't know your why, resilience is a lot harder." The crowd was utterly silent, the weight of Clint's words settling over them like a quiet storm. Even Fiona, who had built her career on quick comebacks and sharp wit, found herself pausing to absorb his message. "But not everyone has a clear purpose," she countered after a moment. "What about those who feel lost, who don't know what they're supposed to be doing? How do they find their why?" Clint leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "You don't find it overnight," he said. "Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it changes, but the key is to keep moving, to work even when it feels pointless, to show up even when it's hard, and to pay attention, because the answers are often in the things you overlook. They're in the people you meet, the opportunities you miss, the challenges you think you can't handle. Purpose isn't something that's given to you. It's something you build piece by piece." A young man in the audience nodded, his face pensive, while a woman in the back dabbed at her eyes discreetly, clearly moved by Clint's words. Eleanor glanced at the crowd, noticing the shift in emotion. She realized that Clint wasn't just talking to her. He was talking to everyone in the room. "That's a powerful perspective," Eleanor admitted, her usual confidence replaced by genuine respect. "But let's bring it back to you for a moment. You've faced criticism, setbacks, even failures. How did you keep going when the world felt like it was against you?" Clint chuckled softly, a warm, rumbling sound. "You keep going because you have to," he said, "because the alternative is giving up, and that's not who I am. Look, Fiona, the world isn't always fair, it's not always kind, but that doesn't mean you stop fighting for what matters. You don't have to win every battle. Sometimes just showing up is enough." The simplicity of his words resonated deeply. Fiona, who had initially seen Clint as a relic of the past, found herself looking at him in a new light. He wasn't just an actor or a symbol of a bygone era. He was a man who had lived, struggled, and learned, and his wisdom was undeniable. As Clint spoke, the audience's earlier energy, marked by cheers and laughter at Fiona's sharp barbs, had transformed into something quieter, more contemplative. The room felt charged with emotion, a shared sense of reflection taking hold. "And let me tell you this," Clint added, his voice becoming more resolute, "resilience isn't just for the big moments. It's in the small things too. It's in the times you bite your tongue instead of lashing out, when you choose to listen instead of argue, when you do the right thing even when no one's watching. Those small moments add up. They shape who you are." The audience erupted in applause, not the loud, boisterous kind that accompanied Fiona's opening monologue, but something deeper, more heartfelt. Clint nodded slightly in acknowledgement, his face calm but grateful. Eleanor glanced at her notes, realizing that her planned questions felt irrelevant. She folded her folder and met Clint's eyes. "I have to admit," she said, her voice laced with admiration, "I didn't expect this conversation to go this way, but I'm glad it did." Clint gave a faint smile. "Life is full of surprises, Fiona," he said. "Sometimes you just have to go with it." The cameras panned across the audience, capturing their thoughtful expressions. In that moment, it was clear that Clint's message had resonated not just with Eleanor but with everyone in the room. Resilience, as he had Sokrasnarichivi put it, wasn't about being unable to slamatsa, but about learning to bend without slamatsa, about getting back up again and again no matter how many times life knocked you down. As the conversation deepened, Eleanor shifted slightly in her Kriya chair, no longer leaning forward with the predatory confidence she had displayed at the start of the interview. Clint remained calm and composed, having Tonka taken control of the room with his words. The audience was mesmerized, hanging on his every word, their earlier laughter replaced by quiet contemplation. "So, Clint," Eleanor said, her voice softer, "you've talked about resilience and purpose, but let's dig a little deeper. You've made some tough choices throughout your career, turning down roles, facing criticism for your views, going against the grain. What fueled those decisions? Was it stubbornness or something else?" Clint chuckled softly, shaking his head. "People like to call it stubbornness," he said, his eyes twinkling, "but I call it integrity. It's about knowing who you are and what you stand for, and refusing to compromise on that no matter how tempting it might be." The word integrity hung in the air. Eleanor tilted her head, intrigued. "But isn't there a price to pay for that?" She pressed, "Staying true to yourself is admirable, but what about the opportunities you miss, the people you alienate? Doesn't that get lonely?" Clint paused, considering her question. "There's always a price," he admitted, "but the price of losing yourself is far greater. I've seen too many people in this industry and in life give up pieces of themselves to fit in, to be liked, to get ahead. And maybe they get what they want in the short term, but in the long run, they end up porozhny, because when you lose your integrity, you lose what makes you you." The audience was utterly silent, his words resonating deeply. Eleanor nodded slowly, sensing the weight of his statement. "Can you give us an example?" she asked, her voice soft. Clint leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "There was a time early in my career," he began, "when I was offered a big role. It would have paid well, and it could have put me on the map, but the character they wanted me to play, he was someone I didn't respect, someone whose actions went against everything I believed in. I needed the money, and I wanted the exposure, but something inside me said this wasn't right. So I turned it down." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And how did that go?" Clint gave a faint smile. "Not great at first," he admitted. "I struggled for a while after that, but eventually I got another opportunity, one that aligned with my values. And because I had been true to myself, I was ready for it. If I had taken that first role, I might have made some quick cash, but I wouldn't have been proud of what I put out into the world, and that matters to me." The audience, who had been so eager to applaud Fiona's clever barbs earlier, now sat in thoughtful silence. Clint's story wasn't just a tale of his past. It was a lesson in the importance of standing by one's principles even when it's hard. "But Hollywood isn't exactly known for rewarding integrity," Eleanor said after a moment, her voice laced with skepticism. "Don't you think that kind of idealism is a bit outdated?" Clint leaned back, his expression calm but resolute. "Perhaps," he said, "but that doesn't make it any less important. Integrity isn't about being rewarded. It's about living with yourself, about being able to look in the mirror and say, 'I did the right thing.' And that's not outdated, that's timeless." A young woman in the audience dabbed at her eyes, her face reflecting a mix of admiration and self-reflection. A man in the back nodded, his expression thoughtful. Clint's words weren't just touching hearts. They were stirring something deeper within the crowd. Eleanor shifted in her Kriya chair, sensing the weight of the moment. "It sounds like you've never doubted your choices," she said, trying to regain her footing. "But surely there were moments when you wondered if it was worth it?" "Of course there were," Clint said without hesitation. "I'm human, Fiona. There were times I questioned myself, when I wondered if I was being too stubborn or idealisticheski. But every time I faced one of those moments, I reminded myself of why I started. I reminded myself that success without integrity isn't really success. It's just an illusion, and that always brought me back to center. The crowd erupted in applause, not the loud, performative kind that accompanied Fiona's opening monologue, but something deeper and more genuine. Clint nodded slightly, his face calm but grateful. Eleanor looked out at the audience, sensing the shift in the room. What had started as a light, confrontational interview had turned into something much deeper. Clint Eastwood, a man she had intended to mock as a relic of the past, had transformed the conversation into a powerful reflection on the importance of integrity and self-respect. As the applause subsided, Eleanor turned back to Clint. "I have to admit," she said, her tone sincere, "you've given me, and I think everyone here, a lot to think about." Clint gave a faint smile. "That's all I can hope for," he said. "Life isn't about convincing everyone to agree with you. It's about planting seeds and letting people make their own decisions. If my words help someone along the way, that's enough for me." The camera zoomed in on Clint's face, capturing his calm, steady expression. The moment felt almost sacred, a rare pausa in the fast-paced world of late-night television. The audience, once ready to jeer at the Hollywood legend, now sat in awe, their earlier skepticism replaced by a profound respect for the man who had lived his life with unwavering integrity. The studio felt different now. The energy that had started the night with a buzz of excitement and anticipation had morphed into something quieter, more introspective. Clint's calm demeanor and heartfelt words had done what Eleanor never expected. The crowd, once firmly on her side, now seemed to hang on Clint's every word. Fiona, though still composed, could sense the shift. "You know," Clint said, breaking the silence that had settled after a particularly moving moment, "it's easy to get caught up in the noise. The world's so loud, so many opinions flying everywhere, everyone shouting to be heard. But the truth, the real truth, it's often found in the quiet moments, when no one's watching." The audience was utterly silent, captivated by the weight of his words. Fiona, usually quick with a witty retort, found herself pausing, letting his statements sink in. She glanced at this Dvorzakdon, who were Berchina still, their focus sharper than ever as they captured the emotion of the moment. "I've been in a lot of loud rooms," Clint continued, his voice deep and steady, Hollywood parties, movie sets, political debates, and you know what I've learned? Noise doesn't equal substance. The loudest voice in the room isn't always the one you should listen to. Sometimes it's the quiet ones who have the most to say. Eleanor shifted in her gray chair, the weight of his words settling over her. For years, she had thrived on being the loudest voice in the room, using her platform to amplify her opinions and challenge those who disagreed. But now, sitting across from Clint Eastwood, she felt a flicker of doubt. Had she truly been listening, or had she just been waiting for her turn to speak? "So, Clint," she said after a pausa, her voice softer than usual, "do you think the world's become too loud, too divided?" Clint gave a faint smile, leaning back in his gray chair. "I think the world's always been divided, Fiona," he replied. "We just hear more about it now because of technology, social media, 24-hour news. Everyone has a platform and everyone's talking, but the question isn't about the noise. It's about what you do with it. Are you adding to the chaos, or are you trying to make sense of it?" The audience murmured softly, their earlier energy replaced by thoughtful stillness. Clint's words weren't just touching hearts, they were resonating. "And what about you?" Eleanor asked, her curiosity genuine. "How do you handle the noise? You've faced criticism for your views, your movies, even your age. How do you deal with all of that?" Clint's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked almost wistful. "You don't let it in," he said simply. "The world can say what it wants about you, but in the end, it's your own voice that matters most. If you start letting other people's opinions define you, you lose yourself, and once you lose yourself, it's hard to get it back." A young woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes, her face reflecting a mix of admiration and self-reflection. A middle-aged man, in the back, nodded solemnly, his arms crossed as he stared at the stage. The audience, once boisterous and quick to laugh at Fiona's sharp barbs, now seemed subdued, their expressions thoughtful. Eleanor glanced at her notes, but they suddenly felt irrelevant. She quietly folded her folder and leaned forward, her eyes meeting Clint's. "You've lived through so many different eras," she said. "Hollywood's changed, the world's changed. Do you think we're heading in the right direction?" Clint took a moment to think, his gaze steady. "I think progress is important," he said, "but progress without reflection can be dangerous. You have to know where you've been to understand where you're going, and sometimes in the rush to move forward, we forget to look back and learn from the past." The studio was silent, the only sound the soft zhuzhania of the cameras. Fiona, usually so quick to steer the conversation, let the moment linger. The audience seemed mesmerized, caught up in the weight of Clint's words. "Look," Clint added, his voice firm but kind, "I'm not here to tell anyone how to live their lives, but I will say this. Don't let the noise drown out your own voice. Don't let the world rush you into decisions you're not ready for. And don't be afraid to stand still for a moment, to reflect, to feel, to listen. That's where you'll find clarity." The applause started softly, almost tentatively, before building into something louder and more genuine. It wasn't the raucous cheering of an entertained audience, but the heartfelt response of people moved by something authentic. Eleanor sat back, her expression thoughtful as she surveyed the crowd. As the chlor subsided, Eleanor turned back to Clint. "I'll be honest," she said, her tone softer than usual. "I came into this interview thinking I was going to be the one asking all the tough questions. But you've made me think about some things I didn't expect." Clint gave a faint smile. "That's the beauty of a good conversation," he said. "It's not about winning or losing. It's about learning." The cameras panned across the audience, capturing their expressions, some smiling, some wiping away tears, others sitting in quiet contemplation. The energy in the room had shifted completely, transformed by Clint's quiet strength and the undeniable truth in his words. Eleanor glanced at her producer, who signaled that the segment was nearing its end. She turned back to Clint, her voice filled with newfound respect. "Thank you," she said simply, "for sharing your story and for reminding us that sometimes the quiet moments matter most." Clint nodded, tipping his imaginary hat. "Thank you for having me, Fiona," he said. "It's been an honor." And as the cameras cut to commercial, the studio remained silent, the weight of Clint's words lingering long after he had spoken them. The energy of the studio had changed significantly. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, the typical post-show buzz and chatter that followed a typical Spotlight late-night episode was absent. Instead, there was a pensive stillness in the air, as if the weight of Clint Eastwood's words still hung in the space. The audience began to rise from their seats, some murmuring softly to each other, others still lost in thought. Eleanor sat motionless at her desk for a moment, staring at her notes. The sharp, biting questions she had carefully crafted now felt hollow and meaningless. She glanced at Clint, who was slowly rising from his gray chair. His dvizhernia were deliberate but graceful for a man of his age. He turned to the audience, tipping his hat once more, receiving a small wave of applause and respectful nods. As Clint stepped off the stage and headed backstage, crew members and producers approached him hesitantly, their earlier skepticism replaced by admiration. A young operator, barely out of college, brought his hand to shake his. "Mr. Eastwood," the man said, his voice slightly trembling, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you said tonight really hit home." Clint gave him a gentle smile, his handshake firm but warm. "Glad to hear it, son," he said. "Life's all about finding what matters to you and holding on to it. Don't let the world tell you any different." Meanwhile, Eleanor retreated to her dressing room, her mind racing. The show hadn't gone as she planned. It had been something entirely different, something she hadn't anticipated. For years, she had prided herself on her ability to dominate conversations, to outwit and outmaneuver even the most formidable guests. But tonight she had been disarmed. Eleanor closed her dressing room door and sank into the Crea chair in front of her vanity. She stared at her reflection, her makeup still perfect under the harsh lights, but her expression told a different story. She felt exposed, as if Clint's words had peeled back a layer she hadn't even realized was there. "Did I listen?" she whispered to herself. The question hung in the air, haunting in its simplicity. Backstage, Clint was packing his things when Fiona's producer, Veronica, approached him. Her usual confidence seemed diminished as she hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I just wanted to say that was incredible. I don't think we've ever had a guest command the room like that." Clint chuckled, his tone humble. "I wasn't trying to command anything," he said, "just speaking my truth. People listen when they're ready to hear it." Scarlett nodded, her respect for him evident. "Well, you certainly gave us all something to think about." As Clint exited the studio, he found his assistant, Ethan, waiting for him by the car. Ethan's expression was a mix of relief and awe. "I've got to say, Clint," Ethan said, opening the car door for him, "I wasn't sure how this would go, but you handled it like a pro." Clint settled into the passenger seat, glancing back at the studio one last time. "It's not about handling, Ethan," he said. "It's about being yourself. The rest takes care of itself." The drive back to his hotel was quiet, the city lights casting long shadows on the streets. Clint gazed out the window, his expression calm but thoughtful. He wasn't one to dwell on moments, but even he could sense that this night had been different. The next morning, clips from the interview flooded social media. People from all walks of life shared their thoughts, some praising Clint for his wisdom, others critiquing Eleanor for her initial approach. However, the overwhelming sentiment was one of respect for both Clint's unwavering authenticity and the unexpected vulnerability of the conversation. Clint Eastwood, a masterclass in integrity, trended on multiple platforms, with users dissecting his statements and sharing how they resonated with their own lives. Fiona's show, usually a ratings magnet for its sharp wit and humor, was now being talked about for entirely different reasons. Back at her apartment, Eleanor scrolled through the feedback, reading comments that ranged from admiration for Clint to criticism of her handling of the interview. She leaned back in her chair, her mind replaying the interview. For the first time in her career, she felt uncertain, not about her talent or ability, but about her approach. Clint's words had forced her to confront a question she had avoided for years. Was she using her platform to truly connect, or just to dominate? That thought lingered as she opened her laptop. Slowly, she began to type a statement, something she rarely did in response to her own episodes. It was brief but felt necessary. "Last night's conversation with Clint Eastwood reminded me of the power of listening. Thank you, Mr. Eastwood, for sharing your wisdom and perspective. You've given us all a lot to think about." She hit publish and leaned back, taking a deep breath. For Clint, the day passed like any other. He returned to his quiet life, undisturbed by the buzz surrounding the interview. He had said what needed to be said, and that was enough. For Fiona, however, the conversation marked a turning point, a moment that would resonate, reshaping how she approached her career and the world around her. And for the audience, that night was more than just entertainment. It was a reminder that amidst the noise, the silent strength of integrity and truth still had the power to stir hearts and minds. The days following Clint Eastwood's appearance on Spotlight Late Night were unlike anything Eleanor Carrington had experienced in her career. The episode went viral, shared and reposted across platforms, not for Fiona's characteristic humor or wit, but for the raw honesty and emotional depth Clint had brought to the conversation. The internet buzzed with reactions, editorials, and comments dissecting the event's unexpected turn. Social media, often a battleground for polarized opinions, was filled with a rare consensus: respect. People from various political strata and generations praised Clint's calm demeanor and genuine wisdom. A clip of him saying, "Integrity isn't about being liked. It's about living with yourself," was viewed millions of times within days. It became a rallying cry for those yearning for authenticity in a world increasingly consumed by noise and pretense. However, Eleanor found herself grappling with a wave of self-reflection. Sitting in her office, she scrolled through the myriad of comments, many praising Clint while others critiqued her initial approach. Though the criticism stung, what resonated more was the undeniable impact Clint had left on her and her audience. For years, she had prided herself on being a sharp, incisive interviewer, but now she wondered if she had focused too much on winning debates rather than fostering genuine dialogue. Her producer, Veronica gently knocked on the door and entered. "Have you seen the numbers?" she asked, holding up a tablet displaying the soaring viewership for the episode. Eleanor nodded absently. "Yeah, I've seen them. This is a win." Veronica continued. "People are talking about the show in a way they never have before. Sure, it wasn't the usual laugh riot, but it was different, and maybe that's not a bad thing." Eleanor looked up, her expression pensive. "It was more than different," she said quietly. "It was real, and not because of me, but because of him." She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "He didn't just sit there and let me banter. He made me think, made everyone think, and that's something I wasn't prepared for." Veronica smiled softly at her. "Maybe that's the kind of guest we need more of, someone who challenges the way we do things." Eleanor nodded slowly, her mind racing. She had spent so much time perfecting the art of cutting through defenses and exposing guests' flaws that she had forgotten what it truly felt like to listen. Clint hadn't fought back with sharp words or aggression. He had simply spoken his truth, and in doing so, he had shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation. For Clint, the aftermath was quieter but no less significant. Back at his ranch in Carmel, he spent his days as he always did, working with his hands, enjoying the surrounding peace, and reflecting on life's simple pleasures. When Ethan, his assistant, showed him a collection of articles lauding the interview, Clint merely chuckled. "Looks like you broke the internet, Clint," Ethan said, scrolling through the headlines. "People are calling it one of the most powerful late-night interviews in years." Clint shrugged, his expression amused. "Funny how the simplest things make the loudest noise." "I wasn't trying to break anything, Ethan, just saying what needed to be said." Ethan grinned. "Well, whatever you did, it worked. People are calling it a masterclass in authenticity." "Authenticity," Clint repeated, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Funny how rare that seems these days." The impact of the interview wasn't limited to social media buzz or glowing articles. It sparked real conversations in homes, workplaces, and classrooms. People debated Clint's philosophies on resilience, integrity, and listening, sharing their own stories of moments when they had to stand by their beliefs or confront their doubts. A teacher in a small Midwestern town played a clip of Clint's monologue for her high school students, igniting a discussion about values and perseverance. A young entrepreneur in Los Angeles cited Clint's advice on staying true to oneself as inspiration to turn down a lucrative deal that didn't align with his vision. The ripples from Clint's words spread further than anyone, including Clint himself, could have imagined. Eleanor wasn't immune to the change either. Weeks after the episode aired, she opened her next show with an unexpected acknowledgement. "Before we get to tonight's guest," she said, her tone uncharacteristically serious, "I want to take a moment to address something that's been on my mind since our last episode with Clint Eastwood." That conversation wasn't just another interview. It was a wake-up call. He reminded me, and I think all of us, about the importance of listening, of being present, and of staying true to ourselves. And I want to thank him for that. The audience responded with surprised but supportive applause. It wasn't the kind of flashy, attention-grabbing moment Eleanor was known for, but it felt right, authentic. Clint's appearance on Spotlight Late Night would go down in television history not as a dramatic confrontation or a viral meme, but as a rare and profound moment of connection. It was a reminder that even in a world consumed by spectacle and noise, there was still room for quiet strength, for integrity, and for the power of listening. For Eleanor, it marked a turning point in her career, prompting her to reassess her approach and use her platform for more meaningful conversations. For Clint, it was another day in a long life lived by his principles, and for the audience, it was a lesson they wouldn't soon forget, a moment that proved that sometimes the quietest voices speak the loudest truths. If you were in that situation, how would you react? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where calmness and wisdom triumphed over harsh criticism? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your stories could inspire and motivate many. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to share it with your friends and family to spread the message of respect and resilience together. Thank you for following and supporting. Please subscribe to the channel to not miss the next inspiring stories. Wishing you a wonderful day and always keeping your faith in good values. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individuals or organizations. They are shared for the purpose of spreading humane values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any errors, please overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.